We have 100,000 people show up. I said, why are we losing California? We don't know. Why would we lose it? It's so corrupt. The whole election process, it's a rigged deal. We have a rigged country. We have rigged elections. The radical left Democrats rigged the presidential election in 2020, and we're not going to allow them to rig the presidential election in 2024.
Former President Donald Trump, in that speech in Detroit on Saturday, still claiming the last election and the whole country are rigged against him. Joining me now, longtime Democratic legal advisor who co-chaired former President Barack Obama's Commission on Election Administration, Bob Bauer. He is the author of a new book entitled The Unraveling: Reflections on Politics Without Ethics and Democracy in Crisis.
You know, Bob, I hope this doesn't.
This is an important book.
I hope you don't take this wrong when I say we're both kind of old, and we've seen a lot. We've been around a lot. I remember when I first came to Washington, D.C., I'd watch Tim Russert on Meet the Press, and he would be interviewing a guy that you work for, Tom Daschle, and Trent Lott. And while the cameras were rolling, those guys, man, it was a 15 round. It was a thrill in Manila, a 15 round and rounder. And afterwards, as you know very well, they were friends, and they would go and they'd talk about how they got things done. Talk about, and I know your book focuses on this, the damage, the scar tissue in American democracy that we've both seen over the past 30, 35, 40 years.
Well, yes, and Joe, I'm not going to dispute your point about my age, but let's just say we're getting on. Maybe not old, but getting on.
Yes, we're getting on. Exactly.
Getting on. Absolutely. I recall when I was younger, a vigorous fight that was reported in the paper between Hubert Humphrey and Barry Goldwater, going back that far. And when it was over, they walked out of the Senate chamber with their arms around each other, sort of arm in arm. And that tolerance for the other side, that understanding that there are disputes, but when the disputes are resolved, we're citizens of the same country, is absolutely critical to the flourishing of this democracy, to the protection of democratic values. And in this book, what I'm attempting to do is to show that at bottom, a democratic politics, an ethical democratic politics, respects difference. It respects, I notice in your last segment, a discussion of lies, it respects a difference between truths and falsehood. Parties do puff up and they argue their cases strenuously, and sometimes each side finds exaggerations in the points of view advanced by the others. But at the end of the day, they respect the voters, and they respect the fundamental importance of conveying truthful information in support of their positions. When that starts to collapse, the democracy is strained. And the book I wrote is about how those of us who have a role in politics and government have an ethical responsibility to attend to the health of our democratic institutions in choices that are made every day.
Bob, I'm old too, so I remember those days. But when did this unraveling begin? Do you trace it to like a moment, to a figure, a person? When did this change happen? And so, you know, imagine a Republican and Democrat walking off the Senate floor today with their arms around each other. When did this happen?
I've observed over the course of my career a striking difference. I got into politics shortly after the Watergate affair. I graduated from law school, and at that time, there was still the basis for that sort of dialogue and a deep belief that it was a necessity, that it was something that, in effect, those in public life owed the public, owed the voters. And that has dissipated. And I understand there are different points of view on how that happened. The key thing is that we have to get back to an appreciation of the ethical dimension of politics and these choices that are made every day, to lie or not to lie, to respect or not to respect an adversary, to respect or not respect the law, to respect the difference between the public and the private, that public office is a public trust and not an opportunity for private political or other gain. These are critical tenets that underlie the flourishing of the democracy. We have to get back to that, but I understand that there are significant disagreements about how we got to the point where we are today.
Yeah, you know, Michael Steele, proving how divided we are. We can't even figure out both sides can't even figure out like what began the Great Divide. If you talk to most conservatives, I'm sure you and me in the past, we look 1987 and the so-called borking of Robert Bork, just complete destruction of his character before he even got out to have his hearings. You talk to a lot of Democrats, they would talk about the class I came in with Newt Gingrich, who, hyper partisan, personalized things, still engaging in just a great exaggeration to get his points through. And so even what caused the Great Divide is still debatable. But those are two good places to start, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. In fact, Joe, I think, this has been a fascinating space for me for a while in trying to contextualize this moment that we see with the unraveling of the Republican Party, the unraveling of our national discourse around some of the things that you and I would stand in alliance against, the Mikas of the world on policy differences, right? So you have this conservative view of America and a traditional liberal view of America, and that space was a safe battleground for a lot of our politicians. But something changed. And Bob, that change is at the core of what began the unraveling. It's the combination of forces, I would think, that the pressure to get power, to hold power, up against the pressure to do good public policy. The last big public policy effort, under Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society effort, ate at some of the underlying fabric around policy, but also stoked this idea that, we need to get the power back. How do you see these elements continuing to shape the unraveling of American political discourse to the point that it is now done so amongst citizens? It's one thing when the politicians have their battle. Now the citizens should be also a part of this unraveling.
Citizens respond to leadership. And if you have leaders, for example, who completely elide the difference or ignore the difference between truth and falsity, who believe that their political adversaries are their enemies and they're not just to be defeated at the polls, they're to be destroyed, then citizens understand politics in a completely different way. But it's not a democratic politics. It is politics. It's about vying for power, but it's not a democratic politics in the small d sense. Your clips at the beginning, which reveal yet again, a refusal to accept the outcome of elections, the suggestion that an election has to be rigged if one side wins and the other side loses. The only explanation for the victory of the one and the loss of the other is rigging. All of that breeds in the citizenry a belief that the politics is corrupt and that the constitutional framework within which we conduct that politics is itself somehow wanting, that we're not committed to those constitutional values. I mean, consider, for example, former President Trump saying that he thought the suspension of the Constitution or the termination of his guarantees might be necessary for him to succeed and for his politics to prevail. That's something the citizens cannot hear. And so, again, it falls to everybody in a position of responsibility in politics, in government, to think about the choices they make every day that bear on whether we have a healthy or an unhealthy democratic politics in this country.
Bob, I was talking about, it's interesting. I say, well, maybe Bork, maybe it was, we came in with Gingrich. I remember, though, I was a really conservative guy. I had a 95 ACU rating. Most Democrats thought I was out of my mind. And yet, every time I was on the floor, I was sitting with Democrats. My close friends, Harold Ford, John Lewis, and I would travel home together more times than not. He called me his travel buddy. Bill Delahunt, God rest his soul. I just loved Bill so much. Maxine Waters, you name it. Like, the most liberal people were good friends with Elijah. My gosh, Elijah. The most liberal people were friends with, in my case, one of the most conservative people in Congress. And guess what? when we needed to do something bipartisan, I'd go to Harold Ford and I'd sign on to one of his bills. Harold would sign on to my bill. We'd do something on long-term care together. In the middle of impeachment, for God's sake, we passed a long-term care bill. We could disagree strenuously, and this was through 2000, 2001, and still be really close friends.
Yes, and those debates are ones that can end in joy for one side and disappointment in the other. A key is recognizing that the debates continue. You might win one day, you lose the next. That's
right.
The way the system operates. And a failure to recognize that and to recognize the humanity and the good faith of fellow citizens, the humanity and good faith of fellow leaders, the failure to do that strikes at the very heart of a democratic self-governance. I mean, what you just described is absolutely critical to the way our politics has to be conducted, and the opposite is extraordinarily damaging to it.
So, Bob, elsewhere in the book, you reveal that you played Donald Trump during Joe Biden's 2020 debate prep. We, of course, have another debate on the horizon in just a week or so's time. So my two questions for you would be, first, are you going to reprise that role? Are you going to be Trump again? And secondly, what other counsel would you give to President Biden as he prepares for this moment?
Well, I can't speak to the advice that I would give to the president in debate prep or any other context. And unfortunately, as you can imagine, I can't actually speak to debate preparations. That wouldn't be appropriate for me to talk about. But that episode that I recount in the book was one that I really enjoyed telling. It was an experience that, and I've done other debate preps before and played other roles like that. That's, again, part of the process. People coming together to hear candidates debate with each other, put themselves before the American public, lay their views out, their competing visions out. And I thought it was a high privilege to have an opportunity in 2020 to participate.